Turbot's primary focus is around cloud governance and automating compliance, security, operations, and cost controls within your public cloud environment. Turbot's main value prop is providing what we call guardrails that provide controls that will prevent your users from taking action that is unwarranted. It also can detect issues and automatically repair them in real time. And so this is helping your application teams have more self-service within Amazon, Azure, Google, and third-party SaaS tools where they can have native access to deploy, make changes, and updates, while Turbot's detecting all of the configuration drift and all the changes that are occurring in the background. And as those changes are occurring, Turbot will either have prevented a misconfiguration. So if a developer tried to provision a Amazon S3 bucket that was publicly exposed, Turbot can explicitly prevent that from happening. Or provisioning a certain image or an AMI or a certain instance type size, Turbot can block something that is not approved by the organization. On the other hand, we can also detect issues and not only just alarm when they do not meet policy for the company, but also if they're not adhering to industry best practices or security benchmarks like CIS, Center for Internet Security. But the power behind Turbot's not just to detect when something's wrong and report it, it's actually to correct it in real time. And so our corrective controls or remediation controls would automatically fix the misconfiguration. And so an example would be if an application team maybe creates that S3 bucket and it's allowed, it's in the right region, it's privately exposed only to resources in that account. So everything is good on the onset. However, it might be misconfigured, like the wrong encryption configuration, or doesn't have versioning on the objects, doesn't have access logging applied, or encryption in transit. Right, so there might be other configurations that do not meet company policy, and Turbot can automate the fixes. And so we can automatically apply the encryption standard, versioning, the bucket policies, etc. And so all that's happening behind the scenes. So Turbot is not an inline product. It actually works off events. So as application team members are making changes, we're capturing the Amazon CloudWatch events, the Azure Monitor log activity, Google Stack Driver. Those events are feeding into your Turbot master that you host and manage. And then Turbot's taking programmatic action to correct anything it sees. On preventative controls, we're managing IAM roles and user policies to explicitly deny or block API registration or provider registration depending on the cloud environment. All of this is helping you elevate as a cloud team to focus on being more supportive to the application team, while application teams have self-service and agility to provision and make changes for their own virtual infrastructure, but they're being managed within boundary conditions or guardrails in the environment. Turbot works with large enterprises as well as across different industries, different regions, all with very similar use cases, whether it's across healthcare, life sciences, aerospace and defense, federal government agencies, to telecom, to media, etc. All of them hit similar requirements to either accelerate their cloud strategy as they're just starting to get into the public cloud at scale. They're looking for an enterprise-wide best-in-class strategy to deploy any type of workload in the cloud. They bring in Turbot to lay a foundation in place that's going to provide any type of controls across compliance, security, operations, and cost that's going to prevent, detect, and correct. And so they can feel more confident putting any type of workload in the cloud, from dev test to highly critical production workloads. And so that helps them move faster safely by migrating workloads. Turbot can help with the operations of those migrations. So as they land into the cloud, we can methodically isolate those workloads into safe landing zones so that fit for use environments for each of those applications are in their own cloud accounts, isolated with their own networking constructs as well as their own identity structures. And with that, we can automate best practices around well-architected frameworks. As an outcome of all of our remediation guardrails, we can always ensure that you're adhering to your internal controls framework or external security best practices or compliance regulatory frameworks. And as an outcome of our policy and identity management, Turbot can also assist with aggregation of identity management across multiple directories. We can manage time-based, role-based access controls and allows for some interesting collaboration patterns or joint venture patterns to manage third parties in your environment with time-based access. So what we do, we're a huge governance platform, so thousands of policies that wrapper across the compliance, the security, the operations, and cost controls. And at a core of our platform is a full stack CMDB. So CMDB is a cloud configuration management database. It has real-time resource discovery. So as you add or associate a Amazon, Azure, or Google project to Turbot, we automatically discover all the resources in the region immediately. We then start layering in policies and controls to start giving you context and awareness of how things are hitting against your policies, how well is it in adherence with CIS benchmarks. But that happens immediately as you associate accounts, that real-time discovery of everything that's out there across your regions, across your services. But as your users make changes in real time, Turbot detects those changes or that configuration drift and reports that back to the CMDB for real-time updates. That CMDB provides context to what those policies and controls are, what those user configurations and that audit trail is. It's fully searchable across our GraphQL backend, and so that you can search any of that metadata in real time consistently across all of your clouds. Now that CMDB is the feeder of information of context for the identity and the policy engine. And so from an identity and access management, we provide a centralized identity and access management and directory management so that you can manage multiple directories against Turbot. We can aggregate your users and profiles and groups, associate them to different layers of your IT stack, whether it's your operating system layer, your cloud accounts like Amazon, Azure, Google. We can be the RBAC controls as well as the time-based access controls for time-based elevation and time-based explicit grants of permissions to your users and your groups, all against the whole hierarchy so that you can set users with permissions globally, with inheritance down. You can do time-based exceptions to those permissions and those grants. We also have a whole policy engine. So there's thousands of pre-canned policies that you can select point and click that will give policy enforcement, whether it's a recommendation policy that will just set a default, and then you can delegate authority down to your application teams to toggle those decisions. You can also set required policies in place that you can only make exceptions to the rule. So there's inheritance, there's exceptions, there's time-based policies, time-based exceptions, and all those policies and controls are reported back in the Turbot for how well you're adhering to those policies against your resources. Fully searchable, real-time dashboards that you can slice and dice the information, all updated in real time with the CMDB. Now that's our core of a CMDB, an identity, and a policy engine. And we've taken those engines and then built on top of that for across Amazon and Azure and Google, so pre-canned policies and controls that sit for those cloud environments, as well as third-party SaaS tools that we integrate with. So we're supporting hundreds of cloud services, thousands of identity actions, all to assist with managing this at scale in a multi-account model with self-service and automated governance. And so beyond the cloud layer of managing your cloud services with prevention and correction controls, you also have all your networking automation, so all of your cloud networking components from your virtual private clouds or virtual networks to your NACLs or security groups or network security groups, your gateways associations, your express routes. All of your boundary conditions, configurations, and routing could be managed in the concept of guardrails. You can explicitly enforce it centrally and lock down people managing your networking. You can also delegate authority to your application teams to manage their own networking components, but under boundary conditions. So you might enforce very specific security group rules, but it may allow certain teams or certain groups of team members to manage security groups within certain boundary conditions. So maybe they're allowed to open up security groups, but only to specific ports or to sources or destinations within your network. So Turbot can manage a centralized enforcement to a delegated authority with automated governance wrapped around them. And that rings true also on the operating system layer. So Turbot can programmatically harden your Windows and Linux machines based on your security policies and guardrails that you have in place. And that might be all the way from the image layer, or even on the cloud service tier like an EC2 instance or a virtual machine in Azure, and you're allowing or denying certain types of instances, whether it's sizing or the images that are allowed to be used for provisioning, all the way through the actual operating system layer itself. So automatically configuring environment variables, syncing in users and groups, marrying up UID and GID when it's in Linux, to syncing in SSH keys, managing the expiration of those keys, to automatically ensuring patching across the environment as well. And so there's a whole slew of features that we can support you on for Windows and Linux, and all of that's in real time. So all the configuration drift that we explained earlier in Amazon, Azure, and Google is also true on Windows and Linux. So all the changes that are happening, feedback in the Turbot into the CMDB, and then you could take programmatic action through the policies that are stated in Turbot. Now all this layers in a context of it could be operational or cost focused. So for example, from an operational standpoint, guardrails could be more focused around always ensuring that you have the right appropriate tags set, so the right key value pairs across your Amazon, Azure, or Google resources, or down to your containers and making sure that they're tagged correctly. Turbot can be used then to search across all that, because all that, those tagging is now in the CMDB, so now you can search across those tags consistently across your clouds, across your hosts. Those type of policies can feed in, those type of tagging scenarios and context can then feed in the policies to take nuanced actions, or conditional logic can then be brought in to why a policy might be set depending on the context of the tag or the context of the resource. From a cost standpoint, you might then use Turbot to more prevent costly actions or to clean up waste in your environment. So Turbot has a concept of active controls that can clean up anything that's aged, so time lived, or last modified, last used. And so there's more practical cost controls in our product to eliminate waste in your environment. From a security and compliance angle, that might be more around enforcing encryption standards on your resources, whether it's in transit or at rest, or helping more from a data protection, like ensuring backups, but then locking it down for no one altering those backups and retaining them on your retention policies. From a compliance standpoint, it might be ensuring those controls because they're in adherence with a third party or an external best practice standard or your internal controls framework. But Turbot can not only just be used for that prevention, correction, and detection, but we also do software configuration management. So all these policies we have pre-canned in the product, but you can also use Turbot to deploy your infrastructure as code stacks. So you can layer in your own Terraform stacks, and then Turbot can continuously enforce those stacks and manage state automatically through our CMDB. We can also be a feedback loop for your developers. So if you use infrastructure as code like Terraform or CloudFormation or ARM templates, etc., you can still do that outside of Turbot. You could deploy to the cloud however you see fit, whether through the console, SDK, CLI, or infrastructure as code. Turbot will be a feedback loop for your developers to know when they're doing something wrong. And that's whether it's a feedback for helping them improve their stack so they don't hit up against guardrails, or it could be helping them simplify their stacks because Turbot's taking care of the configuration for them. They don't need to define that separately in code. All of that is completely extendable. So whether you're using our pre-cam policies, using our calculated policies, to using Terraform within our stack conditions, or you're extending our platform and writing your own guardrails, Turbot can help you in multiple different levels for software configuration management. Now, how it works. So Turbot, by default for an enterprise deployment, you can host and manage Turbot in your own Amazon account. So we are a well-architected framework, highly available, self-healing, auto-scaling, fully reside in this one Amazon account. There's no virtual appliances elsewhere across your clouds. So it's one central command that you can host and manage. We're often set up as an intranet application. So it's internal facing. Us as a company, so Turbot as a company would have zero rights into your environment, so there's no punch in to your environment. So it could be solely contained. Turbot can work through your intranet, talking to the public cloud endpoints, all through proxies or outbound internet, filtering, whatever is your deemed fit for any other type of intranet application on your network. So Turbot can be hosted and managed by you, but we could host and manage Turbot. It's just different support levels. So if you didn't want to host and manage an Amazon account or manage our software, Turbot can host that for you. There's other different distribution models we can talk to you about. But the deployment is that it would be hosted in an Amazon account. It would then have cross-account trust to any of the Amazon, Azure, or Google projects that you associate to it. So in an Amazon world, that's an IAM cross-account role. In Azure, it's an application ID. In Google, it's a client ID. Essentially, it's just system accounts or a system role that's being leveraged by Turbot programmatically. So you can associate that to Turbot. We can then programmatically manage the environment with the CMDB and the policy and identity engine, as discussed earlier. All of this is helping you with one central area to manage policies and identities across your clouds, across a multi-account subscription and projects. This is helping you minimize the blast radius so that you have a model to effectively isolate your applications into their own cloud accounts, and so that you can feel more confident and comfortable managing at scale a multi-cloud and a multi-account model. And that's because we're giving you a very consistent way to manage not only the CMDB and discovery and the drift in one consistent audit trail that's searchable across, but also a policy engine that has the same definitions across Amazon, Azure, Google, Windows, Linux, Kubernetes, and third-party SaaS tools, and a hierarchy that fits all of that into one consistent model. So this gives you the ability to set policies like Amazon S3 bucket encryption could be set for Amazon SSE across all of your Amazon S3 buckets. So you might set that at the top layer, that then that policy inherits down the hierarchy to all of your buckets. Or you might say, well, SSE is enforced everywhere except this one S3 bucket in account A. You can set time-based policies, so you could say, well, I enforce encryption everywhere for the next hour, or for the year, or forever. You could do time-based exceptions as well, so you can say, well, I enforce encryption everywhere except in US East 1 in account A for the next 6 hours. So any of that type of point and click, being able to set things to enforce. You can also set things to just check, which means it just alarms, or you can completely skip it for a certain area or scope. So you might have dev environments or sandbox environments that don't enforce anything. Maybe they just alarm, or maybe they just skip that type of policy. Or other accounts, you might have very explicit enforcements that are required, and the cloud team can only make exceptions to the rule. So very flexible with thousands of pre-canned policies, consistent definitions across your third parties or your entire stack. And that's true on the identity side. So it's the same type of hierarchy that you're defining. Any type of folder structure with nested folders to then define multiple parts of your organization, whether that definition is coming from Amazon orgs or GCP organizations or your Azure tenant and your management groups, or you're defining that individually in Turbot. You can define whatever hierarchy that you set, and from there you're setting policies and also identities across that. And so in this example, you can hook up or you can integrate one or many directories. So LDAP, base directories like OpenLDAP, Active Directory. It could be and or any SAML type of directory, whether that's Okta, Ping Identity, Azure AD, ADFS, Google Authentication, Internet 2, SHIB. Any of those type of directories we fully support. We could do a one-way or bilateral trust. When we have that trust set up, we can do syncing of users, so we can do AD lookups. We can sync users in. We can manage their profiles and their activeness. You can manage multiple directories, and we can pool those directories together. We can bind profiles. You can set those directories at different layers of your hierarchy. So you might have your global Active Directory up top so that your internal teams can then be granted access to anywhere in your hierarchy. You might be trusting a third-party system implementer or managed service provider and just trust their directory to one specific account. However you want to manage your directories in Turbot can be an aggregate. You can then also use Turbot to manage role-based access controls. So they might be able to, you might be able to set a policy where you have, maybe Bob from Active Directory. He's an Amazon S3 read-only. He's an Azure Storage Power user. He's a Linux administrator across all of my accounts. Or maybe Bob's just a Linux admin on this one particular virtual machine for the next 2 hours. So that whole engine there of defining very consistent RBAC controls across your clouds can then be set across anywhere within your organization, even down to a per resource if it's like an operating system. You can activate those so you can approve them immediately. You can then expire them, so never to very specific time frames. You can pre-approve access to be then activated at a later time. So you can do time-based pre-approval, time-based elevation of an active permission. So a number of different scenarios that should satisfy any of your identity and access management needs.